like I was saying, it was really great that Ashley kind of ended with the environmental aspect of this, because now we're going to get really deep into that part of it. And I know that as animal advocates, we are absolutely concerned with the environment as well, and the planet. So we're going to learn more about how this humane hoax affects and impacts the environment with Vasile. So I'm going to go ahead and give his bio right here. We're so grateful that you are able to join us. Vasile Stanescu, he received his PhD in the program for modern thought and literature at Stanford University. He is currently the assistant professor of communications at Mercer University, where his current research interests include locavorism, humane meat, and the intersection between environmentalism and animal studies, as well as other factors in that realm. He is the author of over 20 peer-reviewed publications on critical animal studies, as well as the co-senior editor of Critical Animal Studies book series, the Critical Animal Studies book series. And his research has been recognized by the Woods Institute for the Environment, the Andrew Mellon Foundation, the Culture and Animals Foundation, among others. Today, the title of his presentation is Selling Eden, Environmentalism and the Myth of Humane Meat. We are so happy to have you with us. Please welcome Vasile Stanescu.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. So before I start, there's two groups of people that I want to thank. The first is Hope. I've known Hope for, I think, 8 years now, maybe 9 years. And she has been a constant voice on this. She has this fantastic book that I really encourage everyone to read if you have a chance. She is also the co-organizer of the Conscious Eating Conference, which has really been at the foreground of all of these discussions of humane meat, free-range meat, now in vitro meat. And I just couldn't be more appreciative of the constant work that Hope is doing and continues to do. I also want to thank Justin. I haven't known Justin as long, but we met at a conference when he was talking about the micro sanctuary movement. I was completely blown away. And if you had a chance to listen to Hope and Justin's podcast advertising for this, the two of them managed to speak about humane meat in a cogent, thoughtful, and forceful way. It was some of the best discussion that I've heard on the topic so far, as well as their presentations here. And the group that I want to thank the most is each of you. I'm an academic. All I do is animal studies. If you look at my Facebook, it says I'm a professional vegan. Amateurs, welcome. All I research is what's called critical animal studies, which is the ideas of animal rights or animal liberation applied to the topic of animals in the academy. And all of my work would be completely pointless if it wasn't for you who are working on these topics, taking these ideas, and actually changing the world. So I could not be more grateful. Thank you. Selling Eden, humane meat and the environment. So the main point I want you to take away is that all I work is on animal studies, critical animal studies. And why am I talking about this? So the environment is not my number one concern. I'm an absolute passionate environmentalist, but like many of you, my number one concern is the suffering of non-human animals. But I think we have to focus on this topic because it is the number one topic that you're going to hear if you try to talk to people who are advocating for free-range meat, pasture-raised meat, locavore meat, any of that. What they're going to say is some version of what you heard at the end of Ashley's presentation. Now, let me just say her presentation was fantastic. But as she was gesturing towards the end, the number one argument that you're going to hear is some version of the statement that what they are doing is supporting environmentalism, and they're going to try to frame the discourse. My PhD is in essence in rhetoric. I teach in a communication department. What I study is the way that these discourses are framed. So we're going to try to frame the discourse in a way that puts animal advocates on one side and environmental advocacy on the other side. And once that decision has been made, once they're able to frame it as though they are somehow defending the environment, that's a very difficult rhetorical position for us to be able to respond to. It's also just not true. So while my number one consideration with animal suffering, I think we have to engage the environmental argument. And in addition, if it is true that somehow harming what they're doing is saving the environment and somehow we are harming the environment, that itself would have an animal suffering dimension. So in my talk today, I'll do three things. One, I will summarize the current peer-reviewed research that we have to show that the environmental claims of humane meat are false. So we'll show that their claims are false. We'll summarize the current research on the topic. And then I'll try to explain why it is that these advocates, despite a lack of peer-reviewed research supporting their claims, still continue to believe in these claims and still continue to be able to convince others to believe in those claims. So, key idea. Humane meat advocates routinely claim that their product is environmentally sustainable, and they even claim that it is more environmentally sustainable than veganism. So let's look at a couple of examples. Before I get into this, one sort of professor footnote. Technically, all of these terms refer to a separate type of animal agriculture. So free range is different than locavore, is different than pasture raised. In practice, advocates use these terms basically interchangeably. The scientific research still divide them up, but the actual people who are advocating will use pasture raised, compassion, ethical meat, as though there was no intrinsic difference. So in a similar way, we sort of have to group them together and answer them back writ large. So in Michael Pollan's book, The Omnivore's Dilemma, which to a certain degree, I think started this entire humane meat movement, he claims, indeed, it is quite doubtful that you can build a genuinely sustainable agriculture with animals to cycle nutrients and support local food production. If your concern is the health of nature, rather than, say, the internal consistency of our moral code or the condition of our souls, then eating animals may sometimes be the most ethical thing to do. And so what you'll see is that many of these local or free-range farmers will try to phrase the discourse as though somehow we are irrational, overly emotional, not willing to do what the peer-reviewed research suggests. And they're the ones who are clear-eyed, rational, willing to make the hard choices and following the scientific evidence, as this quote highlights. The reality is exactly the opposite. So here's another example. This is from Catherine Friend. She is a small-scale farmer who's written 3 books advocating the practice. Livestock emit about 18% of the world's annual quantity of methane, one of the bad boys responsible for global warming. They produce this methane as part of their digestion process, and it comes out of burps. We can solve the animal welfare and the environmental issues surrounding meat by getting into grass. That is, animals raised on grass-fed pasture. So it sounds like they're making academic claims or claims that are in some way supported by research. Every memoir or text by a compassionate, humane farmer that I've read, they all make some version of the same environmental claim. Joel Salatin, the featured personality of The Omnivore's Dilemma and Food Inc., and the author of multiple self-published books on the topic, Michael Pollan, Barbara Kingsolver, Catherine Friend, herself, the small-scale farmer and the author of 3 books, they all make some version of this environmental claim. The problem is they provide no citations to support them. There's a host of citations in the book, so depending on the book that you're looking through, there might be citations on the distance the food has traveled, or there might be citations on how terrible factory farms are in terms of the environment. When they make the claim, though, that somehow their product is environmentally sustainable, suddenly the citations vanish. Let me give you one example. So in The Omnivore's Dilemma, and I just wrote this down, it's 464 pages long, so it's quite a large book. The number of times that Michael Pollan uses the word climate change, 0. So even when a citation is provided, so this is back to the quote by Catherine Friend, livestock emits about 18% of the world's annual quantity of methane. There is a citation for that. If you look the citation up, it links to the Christian Science Monitor in an article entitled Humane's Beef with Livestock, A Warmer Planet. The problem of is that this article, in fact, doesn't make her claim. It doesn't argue for small-scale sustainable meat. Additionally, this article references the United Nations report, Livestock's Long Shadow, which many of us are already familiar with. The 2006 report that got international attention when they pointed out that animal agriculture produces more greenhouse gases, 18%, a larger percentage than the transportation industry. This report, though, actually does not argue for small-scale agriculture whatsoever. It actually argues that all forms of animal agriculture have significant problems, and it particularly indicts free-range farming as being a particular culprit. Later United Nations reports have gone even farther. One report in 2013, and the UN has a way of making these really stunning claims in this very bureaucratic language. So this report says, in all environmentally sustainable scenarios, global meat consumption has to decrease by 75%. So the United Nations is not arguing that we need to have a shift from CAFOs, factory farms, to small-scale sustainable farms. The United Nations is arguing that we have to decrease from all sources meat consumption, and they are particularly indicting free-range, small-scale environmental farms as being particularly non-sustainable. So let's take a couple of examples. So this is from the section Atmospheric and Climate Change. Quote, the livestock sector accounts for 9% of atmospheric anthropogenic CO2 emission. The largest share of this derives from land use changes, especially deforestation, caused by expansion of pasture and arable land for feed crops. Or again, under the land degradation section, quote, expansion of livestock production is a key factor in deforestation, especially in Latin America, where the greatest amount of deforestation is occurring. 70% of previously forested land in the Amazon is occupied by pastures and rangeland, with 73% of rangeland in dry areas, which have been degraded to some extent, mostly through overgrazing, compassion, and erosion created by livestock action. Let me just point out that this original Livestock Long Shadow report came out in 2006. We have a series of other reports. The conclusions I've highlighted have been even more in the same direction. The percentage has changed. So you may have heard that instead of 18%, they now peg global meat production, the CO2 emission of livestock, at 14%. But that's not because animal agriculture has gotten better. It hasn't. It's gotten worse. It's that the percentage has gone down just because we're polluting in so many other areas. So it's now 14% instead of 18%, but animal agriculture, actual CO2 production has gone up. So a friend does the same thing again in Sheepish. That's the most recent book that she's published. She cites Frank Mitholiner. Frank Mitholiner is an interesting guy. He is basically the paid apologist for the factory farm industry. He does not have a PhD in climate change whatsoever. His actual degree is just in animal agriculture, but he does have this thick German accent, and so they sort of pay him to go out and debunk claims that factory farming is harmful for the environment. But it's particularly ironic to cite him because he both does not actually support pasture-raised livestock. That's not who's paying his check. He explicitly advocates for factory farming as the environmental model for the entire world. He's funded by the factory farms, and he does not, in fact, disprove that animal agriculture produces 18% of all greenhouse gas emissions. So just to be clear, in two separate books, Friend cites work that specifically critiques what she's doing as the scientific proof that it is working. And of everyone I've cited so far, Joel Salatin, Michael Pollan, Barbara Kingsolver, she's the only one to even provide a citation whatsoever. So the only citations I can find are not, in fact, actual citations. So why are they not citing peer-reviewed research to claim that the environmental impact actually works? It's in part because they can't actually find studies that make this argument. So let's take a look at what the actual studies show of the GHG, the climate change impacts of humane meat. So focusing just on the local aspect, and I put the actual citation for the studies at the bottom. I won't go through the title to throw off the presentation, but I'll make this slideshow open to anyone that wants to take a look. So looking just at the local aspect of meat for locavorism, researchers have found little benefit. The transportation greenhouse gas emissions is relatively minor, and specifically in this last stage, which is all that locavorism would affect. So from the slaughterhouse to the consumer, or from even maybe the store to the consumer, it's virtually negligible. The exact percentage is less than 0.6% of greenhouse gas emissions. So the same research actually compared a local diet based on meat versus a vegetarian diet. And it concluded that shifting from beef to vegetables for even a single day a week would be more helpful in reducing greenhouse gases than shifting the entirety of one's diet to exclusively locally produced animal sources. So that's one day. It's worse in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. Not the same, not better, worse. Nathan Peltier estimates that pasture-raised cattle actually result in 50% more greenhouse gas emissions than cattle raised on factory farms. As he said, quote, "We do see a significant difference in the GHG intensities of grass versus grain finishing. It's roughly in the order of 50% higher in grass finished systems." That's free range farming. He also estimates that replacing all meat with soy or other plant-based protein would decrease the GHG emissions from protein creation in the Western diet by 96%. 96%. Adrian Williams has found that free range and organic range chicken have 20% greater impact on global warming than chickens raised in factory farm conditions. And he found that organic eggs have 14% higher impact on climate than factory farm eggs. And again, the citations for all these studies are right below. The reasons for what might seem counterintuitive is that the free range animals take longer to gain weight. As horrible as the CAFO system is, and I absolutely agree that it is, the one thing they have figured out how to do well is to produce lots of pounds of meat very, very quickly in a small amount of space. Many of their inhumane conditions, they do because they do work in creating pounds of flesh. So cramming animals into small spaces, not letting them move, actually increases the amount of fat that they generate. Keeping them indoors, controlling the lighting, controlling the, stuffing them full of antibiotics, force feeding them on grain. All of these are strategies to increase pounds of flesh. So free range animals take longer to gain weight, they consume more feed, they, quote, burp more, they have more excrement. And remember all those quotations from the United Nations of deforestation and land use changes? They take up more room. So we have this idea, okay, CAFOs mean factory farms, confined is in the name, confined animal feeding operations are the problem. The solution is we'll just open the cages and let them roam free. The problem is there's no room to do that on the planet. So assume the globe, subtract the oceans, subtract the ice caps. So we're talking about the ice-free terrestrial surface of the planet, the actual land that we have left. A third of that is already used for animal agriculture, a third of the entire planet. So we can't just open the cages and let the animals go. There's no room for them to go. 80% of all land used by humans for any purpose whatsoever is already used for animal agriculture, 80%. So for example, I have a friend, he just moved into a suburb. He's like, oh, I love living here. I get to see the deer. And I'm like, what are you doing? The deer are here because you are now living in their home. That 80%, those suburbs, those highways, that's already factored in. We don't have the room for free range animals. So the most important idea I would like you to take away today is that, of course, factory farms, CAFOs, are terrible in terms of climate change. And many of these same humane farmers will do these citations as though somehow criticizing factory farm is an endorsement of their system. Of course, they're terrible for the environment. Lagoons of manure. We all know this. However, humane meat is not better for the environment than factory farms, and it may arguably be worse. And I think this is so important because I think even some vegan advocates even while they're engaging in vegan advocacy, we'll be talking to somebody and that person will say, well, I want to move to some version of humane meat or free range eggs. And we might feel like, okay, they're not doing all that they can, but they're doing something. They're on the path. It's not what we want, but it's better than the alternative. It's better than factory farms. It's better than not doing anything at all. And I would question that idea. I would argue that they are not on a path towards veganism, and I would argue they are not on a path towards animal liberation for all the more reasons that we just heard. I would also argue, though, that they're not even on a path in terms of helping the environment, nor would I argue they're on a path of animal welfare, which I'll talk about more later. They're just differently bad. So that's climate change. What about species extinction? The UN estimates that livestock production, including free-range and pasture-raised animals, represents the leading cause of species extinction. The leading cause. We are in an era of unprecedented threats to the biodiversity. The loss of species is estimated to be running 50 to 500 times higher than the background rate in the fossil record. 15 of the 24 important ecosystems are said to be in decline. Livestock now accounts for 20% of the total terrestrial animal biomass, and 30% of the Earth's land surface is now preempted. Habitat for wildlife has now been preempted. Indeed, the livestock sector may well be the leading player in the reduction of biodiversity, since it is the major driver of deforestation, as well as the leading driver of land degradation, pollution, climate change, overfishing, sedimentation of coastal areas, and facilitation of invasion by alien species. So in summary, species loss is 50 to 500 times higher than background rates. I think we all know this. We're living through the sixth great extinction. Species are going extinct faster than we can find them. Livestock is 20% of the total terrestrial biomass already. As we already discussed, livestock occupies 30% of the Earth's entire land surface already. And the humane farmers admit it. So Joe Salatin, this most famous locavore farmer, is very clear in his memoir, Everything I Want to Do is Illegal, what a great name, that he is only able to raise animals outdoor because he actually kills all the predators, endangered animals, such as red-tailed hawks. This is the way he describes it. He says, imagine how much he's saying to the reader, you enjoy eating pasture-raised chickens. Now imagine hawks enjoying eating these chickens 10 times as much as you do. So the only way I'm able to raise them is to kill the hawks. And even neighborhood dogs. He says that they have a code of shoot, shovel, and so the dogs will kill the chickens, and so they kill the dogs. If there's a stray dog or they don't know who the dog is, they shoot the dog and they bury the dog, and they just don't talk about it. And he even points out the contrast. So this is a quote from Joe Salatin. The greatest inconsistency of this is the people most vocal about protecting animal rights are the ones who most appreciate pastured poultry, pastured pork, and grass-based beef. But what he's saying is that the only way he's able to create this pastured poultry, pastured pork, and grass-fed beef is to kill other animals. It's in that context that he makes this quotation, that is to sit out there with a shotgun and shoot all the predators in order to keep the animals safe. Although, of course, he then later kills them. The United States federal government kills animals. Since 2000, the Wildlife Services operatives have killed 2 million native mammals and 15 million native birds. Several are listed as endangered or threatened under the Endangered Species Act. In 2014, Wildlife Services killed 322 wolves, 61,702 coyotes, 2,930 foxes, 580 black bears, 796 bobcats, 5 golden eagles, 3 bald eagles, and tens of thousands of beavers, squirrels, and prairie dogs. They don't even keep numbers. And that's in 1 year. Here's a quotation from an article on the topic. Wildlife Services gunned down coyotes from airplanes and helicopters. Its trappers used poison baits, cyanide traps, leg hold traps, and neck snares. They hauled coyote pups from dens with links of barbed wire, strangled them, or clubbed them. Sometimes they set the animals on fire in the dens or suffocated them with explosive cartridges of carbon monoxide. We joked about using napalm, Denier, a retired member of the service. So I would say not only in terms of the environment, but also in terms of animal welfare. It is true, as we have already heard, that humane farms are frequently identical to factory farms or only minimally necessary. We see an increasing growth of farms who, the same business will simply create a different brand. So one brand name will be the factory farm brand, and one brand will be the humane brand, and they will do whatever is minimally necessary to be able to repackage that new brand at a significantly higher price and be able to get a different niche market, basic marketing, niche marketing. But we don't even have to pretend that the people care about animals whatsoever, because it's literally the same company and the same people that are increasingly diversifying in order to get the humane market. So all of that is true. But even if it was not true, I would argue that also part of the problem is the current optics we have is that people focus on that pasture-raised chicken of Joe Salatin, and they go, okay, that chicken has a minimally better life than a chicken raised in the factory farm setting. But what the optic hides is all of the other animals that Joe Salatin has to kill in order for that one chicken to have a slightly, or claim to have a slightly better life, or all the other animals that the United States federal government is killing on a routine basis to protect free-range pastured animals, pastured sheep, what have you. And so their lives and suffering, which arguably might be the best possible life an animal can have, wild animals' lives are all being killed in horrible conditions, and there's very little discussion of those deaths. So even separate from the complete way in which the humane hoax operates on the factory, on the so-called humane farms themselves, there's mass animal suffering that the practitioners themselves admit has to occur in order to produce this product whatsoever. So main points. Humane meat advocates claim that the product is helpful for the environment routinely across every text that I've read. These claims are not supported by peer-reviewed research, and for the most part, they don't even provide a citation, and the few citations I can find don't actually check out. The actual research suggests exactly the opposite, and I've only skimmed some of the studies. There are a great number of larger studies that come to similar conclusions. This is true in terms of both climate change and species loss. Final idea to keep in mind. Even if everything I said today was wrong, even if it was somehow sustainable to create the current amount of meat that we have now via humane farming, meat eating is doubling. So in 2006, we had about 55 billion land animals, so that's excluding fish, and that's just for human consumption, so that's excluding fur, that's excluding experimentation, that's excluding leather, that's excluding entertainment. So there's 55 land animals raised and killed to eat each year in 2006. We're on the path to 120 land animals by 2020, and we are already on that path. So why is that happening? There's an increasing world population, there's just more of us, and there's increasing per capita meat consumption. And it's happening particularly in countries with very large populations like China, India, and Brazil, and relatively low amounts of meat consumption. So for example, my wife and I had an exchange student from China that lived with us, and he was very confused because he said, look, why are you not eating meat we look up to eating meat. We go to KFC. KFC is actually a luxury restaurant for us. So these other countries are looking to the West. They're seeing eating meat as a status symbol, as a way of like showing wealth, and they're trying to scale up as their own wealth increases, become more Western, scale up their own meat eating to be urban, to be cosmopolitan. But when you have billions of people doing this, there is no possible way to produce those number of animals. Remember, we already consume over a third of the planet. So this is a problem without a solution. How to sustainably raise and kill 120 billion land animals a year, not since we started eating meat, every single year, is a problem without a solution. Not CAFOs, not humane meat. It simply cannot be done. And there are zero peer-reviewed studies that have figured out a way or a claim that there's a way to do it. Let me also make a point here in terms of an argument that I've heard frequently made of the trade-off. You may have heard this argument as well. Someone will say, oh, a backyard slaughter animal. Well, yes, maybe they're not treated as well as we hear or as well as is being advertised, but at least they had a better life than if they'd been in a factory farm. The problem with this argument is it assumes a static rate of animal production and death. So if we only raised and killed a set number, if we only raised and killed 100 animals, then you could say, sure, each animal that we're now raising in our backyard is trading off with an animal in the factory farm system. What we have is an exponentially increasing system of animal production. There's not a trade-off. What we see is the growth of the so-called humane free-range animal system in parallel with the growth of the factory farm system. So both systems are just killing more animals all the time, and they have to. If you already are covering a third of the planet, if you're already covering 80% of all of the land used for humans for any purpose whatsoever, the only way to try to meet demand is to stick animals everywhere you can. So someone who's now raising and killing an animal in their backyard is not trading off with the factory farm. They're hiding the fact that the system itself is not sustainable, and they're finding ever new places and opportunities to try to produce this meat to be able to meet this demand, which simply cannot be met. So there is no trade-off. There is an exponential increase in the system. So if they don't have evidence to back up their claims, if the advocates themselves admit in their memoirs that they're killing animals to support the system, if the advocates themselves are pointing out the contradiction that people who claim the most to care about animals are the biggest advocates for the products they're making, why are they still making these claims, and why are people believing them? To try to understand this, I want to share with you a quotation of one of the more interesting people, I think, in this entire system. So this is Nicolette Nyman. And she calls herself a vegetarian, by which she means she herself personally will not consume animal products. She's also the former co-founder and co-owner of Nyman Ranch, the largest producer of humane meat, so-called humane meat in the country. So she raises meat she won't eat. To explain this contradiction, she made the following claim. Quote, as I see it, animals have entered into an arrangement with humans, an exchange of sorts. When animal husbandry is done, as it should be, humans can provide animals a better life than they could hope for in the wild, and almost certainly a better death. That's quite significant. I have accidentally left the gate open here on a number of occasions. Not one of the animals has even left the area. They don't go out because what they have here is the safety of the herd, really nice pasture, water, occasional hay, and plenty of predictability. And their friends are here. To a certain degree, they choose to stay. Now, what is interesting about this argument is that every single text for humane meat, all of them, they all make the same argument. So if any of you have read like John Locke or Hobbes, there's this idea of like a natural contract that as citizens at some undefined time, at some undefined place, in kind of unwritten prehistory, we have somehow agreed to be ruled by the collective, the king, what have you. They all sort of make a similar argument, saying that animals at some time and some place have all agreed to be ruled by humans for the benefit of the animals. Of course, on its face, the argument makes no sense. As Foyer says it, chickens can do many brilliant and wonderful things. They cannot enter into complicated agreements with humans. Despite this, every advocate for humane meat makes this argument. Michael Pollan, Joel Salatin, Catherine Friend, Kathy Rudy, who's actually an academic, Donna Haraway, who's actually an academic. Every text makes this claim. So, while humane meat advocates can be quite grueling in their critique of confined animal feeding operations, CAFOs, since such factory farms are seen as violating this original contract between humans and other animals. At the same time, these farms are not wrong in the minds of their proponents because they kill, own, or imprison animals, but only because they fail to adequately treat animals well before they are killed. In other words, they argue that the factory farms are only wrong because they have broken the human end of the supposed natural contract between humans and other animals. And behind this is two ideas of nature. So one idea of nature is the idea of like a stable ecosystem that we can assess, climate change, environmentalism, ecology. And under this view of nature, there is no question that veganism is unnatural, since by virtually all accounts, it is the single most sustainable diet that anyone can choose. But there is another meaning that when people say nature, that they can mean and we can hear. And that's nature as a sense of teleological ends, as a kind of chain of being that is designedly set to order the universe. Someone says, oh, well, that's unnatural. And it's under this view of nature that veganism and animal rights can be unnatural in the sense that we represent an aversion of this supposed natural order of humans' benevolent rule over all other animals. So let me give you the best example. This is from Michael Pollan in The Omnivore's Dilemma. For domesticated species, the good life, if we can call it that, cannot be achieved apart from humans, apart from our farms, and therefore our meat eating. This, it seems to me, is when animal rights betrays a profound ignorance about the workings of nature. Now, when he says nature here, he clearly doesn't mean climate change or a stable ecosystem. He doesn't even use the word climate change. What he means here when he says the workings of nature is this kind of teleological end, that only humans can actually provide animals the good life. Wild animals presumably wouldn't have it. And he's talking about his supposed idea of a natural contract between humans and animals, which animal rights activists are supposedly violating. Likewise, Joel Salatin, who's opposed to all forms of factory farms, still believes that animals, unlike humans, quote, lack a soul, so when they die, they just die. So, third main idea. When advocates for humane meat speak about factory farms as being unnatural, it may sound as though they're making an argument about global warming or climate change. Often, they are not. Best example of this, despite wildly reported claims to the contrary. If you Google Joe Salatin, the first several hits that come up, including multiple YouTube talks where he uses terminology like carbon sequestration, or we just heard about the regenerative grazing, which all sound, and Joel Salatin himself says a lengthy talk about regenerative grazing, which all sound as though he's making nuanced scientific claims about climate change. Joel Salatin is a climate change denier. He does not believe that human-caused anthropogenic climate change is occurring. He told me this in person. I was invited out to debate Joe Salatin in Vermont. There was a massive auditorium. Every single person there in Vermont, Vermont is a large locavore state. Every single person there was to see Joel Salatin. Nobody was there to see me. Could not be a more hostile crowd. But during the course of the debate, I went through each of the studies that we've already been talking about. And I just asked him, I said, how do you make sense of this? And what he told to me was not that I had somehow misunderstood a study or that he had a different interpretation or he knew of a study I was unaware of. What he said was he just didn't believe in climate change. He didn't think humans were causing it, and he didn't really believe in science at all. And even though I coach debate as my personal hobby, I coached the debate team at my school, I had no idea what to say at that moment. And it actually left me speechless as I just stared at Joel Salatin as he was telling me that he just doesn't believe in climate change. He's recently repeated this in print, quote, on climate change, I grew up inundated with the science that by now we would enter a new ice age. Now we're going to burn up. I don't believe either, and I don't think we know enough. Science is limited to what we can observe and what we can duplicate. Much of this is outside the realm of science. Now, I'm not saying everyone who believes in locavorism or free-range meat is a climate change denier in the form of Joe Salatin. They certainly are not. I do think it is important to ask why so many people are taking their environmental advice from someone who does not believe either in human-caused climate change or in science itself. So, fifth main idea, humane meat represents a pastoral return to a supposed former time of Edenic innocence, man's dominion over other animals, not an actual or effective environmental agricultural policy to combat global climate change. It's a belief system, a confirmation bias. It is not a peer-reviewed scientific idea, even though often the practitioners will try to use scientific terminology when they are advocating for this or when they're debating against you. So, conclusion. Advocates for humane meat claim that their product is helpful for the environment. Such claims are false. Peer-reviewed research suggests that they are worse for the environment, at least in terms of climate change and species extinction. It may be better in terms of, say, water pollution. They choose to believe in these claims despite a lack of evidence because of their belief in a supposed natural contract between humans and animals. And I'd like to end with a final quote. So this is a later debate that Joel Salatin had with another researcher who, much like I did, went through each of the studies, particularly on this idea of regenerative grazing that we just heard so much about. And Joel Salatin's answer was, quote, we need the poets and the prophets and the liberal arts students to protect us from the amoral machinations of the technicians in the science department. Maybe, but that is clearly manifestly not a scientific view on how to fight climate change. And I would say, in the words of the United Nations, in all effective environmental scenarios, global meat production has to decrease. Thank you. And here is my email address. Please reach out to me in any way that I can help on any of your programs that you may be doing related to this topic.
All right. Thank you, Vasile. That was wonderful. Absolutely amazing. And there's been some really interesting stuff going on in the chat comments. If anybody has questions, you can pop them into the chat. One thing that I would love to maybe hear a little more about is, I often see people really saying that not only is regenerative grazing, and I know we talked a lot about it, but that not only is it a little better, but it's actually, the answer. It's actually going to save the planet. And it's really interesting that they can make these gigantic claims with very little evidence that that's actually happening. And like you said, there's practically zero peer-reviewed science around this. But it's kind of a meme now that's going around. And as Ashley stated, it's kind of the new thing that they are that we're hearing, to be able to maintain this sustainable and humane animal agriculture. So I don't know if you just want to touch on that a little bit about how there can be, so much. I think it's what people want to believe. They really want to believe they can have their meat and eat it too. But maybe just talk a little about that, about how these things get so blown up. And I don't know if you want to go into that a little bit more. And I'm going to look and see what kind of questions we have in the chat.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I would just make 2 points. The first one is I thought Ashley started out with the most important part in her presentation, which is that eating meat is not needed for virtually all people. And so, how can you imagine a way in which eating meat is essential? Well, one way you can imagine it is you can decide that it is essential for protecting the environment. And if true, then that would flip the entire context of the debate. And you would say, okay, only by this type of grazing, only by not using fossil fuels to bring in the products from long distance, only by fertilization from animals. And what's interesting is the exact reason why it's necessary to change the environment will change over time as they become increasingly debunked, or by author, but the idea that we have an essential need for animal products stays the same. And what they do is say, okay, because we have to protect the environment, the only way to do that is actually to do animal agriculture. It doesn't matter to them exactly if they have peer-reviewed research, because it's such a deeply held belief system. And the second point I would say is we have an awareness of the right of kind of like an anti-science movement, climate change denial, what have you. There are ways in which the left can sometimes have that as well, anti-vaccine movement, what have you. And what we see with the humane meat movement is this convergence of these extreme right-wing folks, extreme left-wing folks who come together and actually sort of cherry pick whatever scientific terms they want, discount most of the actual research that's done on it, and trying to argue with them is extremely difficult. It reminds me of the old saying about the person who went to the doctor and he said, I'm dead. And the doctor said, okay, do dead men bleed? And the man said, certainly not. And so he picked the doctor, the doctor picked him with a pin and blood started coming out. And he said, oh no, what do you know? Dead men do bleed. And so experience debating where it's like, okay, I've now debunked this argument, and then the whole parameters of the debate shift. Because the simple truth is we're dealing more with the belief system that happened first, and then the evidence is found to support this pre-existing belief system of this natural contract idea, than a sort of bottom-up idea of like, okay, we've read these studies and come to this conclusion.
Yeah. Great. So there were some questions. I'm going to scroll back here. There was one that, I know this is going to be a tough question, but we'll go ahead and I'm just going to read this. It says, my former department chair claimed to be a vegan, but he ate animal products, cheese, eggs, fish, when at international conferences out of convenience. At home, he was a dietary vegan. He also kept backyard chickens and said he would eat their eggs, knowing how happy their lives were under his care. How do I approach such a person with the knowledge you shared without being confrontational or off-putting? No one has, especially, no one, and especially not people who think they are eating ethically, wants to be told their acts are unethical. So this, of course, is a tough one. It has to do with, how do we approach people with this information? What's the best thing to do? I have some thoughts on it, but I'll let you open us up.
So I can't speak to this individual incident. What I will say is I teach a class on animals every year since I've been teaching. And almost none of my students are vegetarian or vegan when they take the class. If I have two students that are vegetarian or vegan, that's remarkable. Many of them take it because it fits into their schedule. They may have no thoughts about animals at all when they came. I surveyed one time, why they took this class, and one of them said, he said he loves safaris. I said, why do you take this class? And he said, I love to argue. So very hostile students. When I first started teaching the class, I just, preached at them as hard as I could. This was finally my chance to let it all out, and I was completely ineffectual. Over time, I've moved to a system where we just study the evidence, and they can come to their own logical conclusion, whatever that may be, based on the evidence that I'm presenting them. And the hostility has plummeted, and the number of students who have started to transition to a vegetarian or vegan diet has skyrocketed. I mean, the truth is the evidence is overwhelmingly on one side. It's like the climate change debate. You have 99 scientists on one side and one scientist on the other. So there's no topic that we can't just read through or talk about. I now actually have a disclaimer in the class. I say, if any student can defend animal agriculture, not to me, but just to two other students in class that you choose, you just get an A in the course. You don't have to do any other work. And so far, we haven't had a single student take on the challenge.
Wow. Amazing. All right. Let me see if there's any other questions here. People are helping each other with resources. Someone asked about getting resources around the regenerative grazing issue, the holistic grazing issue, and like links. And so people are sharing like how they can do that. There was a question, where can we find your articles online?
So I'm slowly uploading them on academia.edu. There's two right now. The first one is Green Eggs and Ham, the myth of environmentally sustainable meat. The second
That's a great one.
Crocodile Tears, which indicts this idea of compassionate farming. There's a book that I'm currently working on, fingers crossed that'll be coming out soon, which has the same title as this talk, which is Selling Eden. An article version of that is coming out, is forthcoming. So you just Google Selling Eden and my name, it should come up. Also, Google Scholar has all of the different articles indexed. And finally, if there's any problems at all, if you run into any paywalls, anything, just let me know. Just send me an email. I'm happy to send every single thing I've ever written. My only goal is to try to get the information out there.
Wonderful. That's amazing. That's great. And you'll be contributing a chapter to the Humane Hoax anthology that we're going to be creating and collaborating on. So that's exciting. So yes, more to come from Vasile. So any final thoughts? And I'll look and see if there's any other questions. There's been a lot posted, so I'm going to scroll back through, but any final thoughts? We still have about 4 minutes.
Yes, one final thought I would like to leave everyone with. So the United Nations just recently released a report saying that we have a very short window in order to make significant changes to prevent catastrophic climate change. Of course, climate change is already occurring, but the degree of how terrible the effects will be are still within our control. This report made international headlines. The report itself actually engaged in a sort of low-key, what I would argue, climate change denial, because while it admitted all the science we talked about, the United Nations' own science, it said, well, we admit all, and of course I'm paraphrasing, but it said, we admit all of this is happening, but we don't know what to do about it. How can we change people's behavior? Maybe this isn't what we need to focus on, even though we wholly admit all the science is true. So what I would say is increasingly across the board, what people who come to my class that I talk to who care about animals or are starting to go vegetarian or starting to go vegan, what is drawing them is less the health argument, less the even the animal suffering argument. Increasingly, it is the climate change argument. And I
Mm.
believe that we need to find a way to unite the growing environmental movement. You know, Al Gore actually went vegan, and the animal rights movement in a shared struggle, and the food justice movement in a shared struggle that says, look, we agree on all of these topics. I'm an environmentalist. I care about food justice. I've worked to stop food deserts. I'm a locavore in terms of produce. You know, so I'm an environmentalist. I care about food justice, and I care about animals. They don't, in fact, contradict. There is actually only one sensical, logical philosophy that unites all of these, and that's a shared struggle for the environment, for animals, and for all of us. That's what I believe.
Beautiful. Yeah, absolutely. It's, you know, we're so paralleled in so many things with environmentalism and animal advocacy, and we really need to bring those movements together. Absolutely. So, so powerful. Thank you so much, Vasile. I really appreciate everything you're doing. Your beautiful mind around all this incredible work is so important. So, thank you so, so, so much.